The town of Laurel Creek, Alabama, nestled along the winding banks of the Blackwater River, carried a quiet charm that hid its scars. In the fading light of a humid September evening, the river's surface shimmered like liquid coal, reflecting the old wooden homes of Blackwater Row, the last remnant of a historic black neighborhood forged in the shadow of the Civil War. Ruth Jackson, at 73, stood on the creaking porch of her family's century-old house, her silver hair catching the breeze. A retired schoolteacher with a spine of steel, she'd spent decades shaping young minds in this town. Now her gaze lingered on the river, a silent witness to the resilience of her ancestors. Tonight, though, something felt off, an unease she couldn't name. Earlier that day, an embossed invitation had arrived from the Laurel Arts Gallery, a sleek brick building downtown. It was from Samuel Carter, one of her brightest former students, now a rising artist. He'd begged her to attend his exhibition opening, promising a piece that honored Blackwater Row's legacy. Ruth smiled at the thought. Samuel's talent had always burned bright, even as a boy sketching in her classroom. She'd wear her best dress, the deep green one her late husband Isaiah had loved, and the pearl earrings he'd given her for their 40th anniversary. But as she folded the invitation, a chill crept up her spine. Across the street, a black sedan idled under a sagging oak, its headlights flickering once, twice, then going dark, like a predator blinking in the dusk. Ruth's eyes narrowed as the sedan lingered, its engine humming low, like a distant threat. She'd lived in Laurel Creek long enough to know trouble didn't always announce itself with a shout. Sometimes it crept in, quiet as the river's current. Her fingers tightened around the porch railing, the wood worn smooth by years of her touch. That car wasn't local. Its tinted windows and polished frames screamed money, the kind that didn't belong in Blackwater Row. For weeks, whispers had swirled through town about Edwin Caldwell, a real estate tycoon whose empire had swallowed half of Alabama's small towns. His shadow loomed over every for sale sign, every bulldozed lot. Ruth's house, with its sagging eaves and stubborn roots, was the last holdout in his path. A prize he'd been chasing with offers she'd refused again and again. She shook off the unease and turned back inside, the invitation still clutched in her hand. Samuel's event was a chance to celebrate, not cower. Yet as she dressed, pinning her hair into a neat bun, the sedan's presence gnawed at her. Caldwell's name had come up too often lately, over coffee at the diner, in hushed tones at church. He wanted Blackwater Row gone, its history paved over for condos and chain stores. Ruth wasn't naive. She knew men like him didn't stop at no. As she slipped on her earrings, a single thought crystallized. Tonight wasn't just about art. It was the opening move in a game she hadn't chosen to play. The Laurel Arts Gallery glowed like a jewel against the humid Alabama night, its brick facade and wide glass windows casting warm light onto the street. Ruth Jackson stepped inside, her green dress swaying slightly, the pearls at her ears catching the chandelier's gleam. The air buzzed with the murmur of Laurel Creek's elite. White-gloved waiters weaving through the crowd, champagne flutes clinking in manicured hands. She scanned the room and spotted Samuel Carter near a towering canvas, his broad smile lighting up as he waved her over. "Miss Ruth, you made it," he called, his voice cutting through the hum. The painting behind him, a vivid swirl of reds, blacks, and golds, told the story of Blackwater Row, hands planting seeds, faces lifted in song, a river running through it all. Ruth's chest swelled with pride. This was her legacy, etched in color. But the warmth faded as a hush fell over the room. Leonard Hayes, the gallery owner, stepped to the center, his tailored suit pristine, but his eyes darting nervously. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice tight, "I regret to inform you that the Tears of Magnolia, our prized diamond necklace on loan for tonight's auction, has been stolen." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ruth frowned, her mind flashing to the display case she'd passed earlier. It had been locked, undisturbed. Before she could process it, heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Two police officers, Roy Baxter, tall and scowling, and his wiry partner Ellis Kane, cut through the guests, their hands on their holsters, heading straight for her. "Ruth Jackson!" Roy Baxter barked, his voice loud enough to draw every eye in the gallery. We need you to come with us. Ruth straightened, her calm exterior unshaken despite the tremor in her chest. What's this about, officer? She asked, her tone steady as steel. Baxter's scowl deepened. You were seen near the display case right before the necklace went missing. We've got a witness. Ruth's gaze flicked to Leonard, who avoided her eyes, his fingers twitching around his champagne glass. That's nonsense, Samuel interjected, stepping forward, his face flushed with anger. She's been with me the whole time. Baxter shoved him back with a meaty hand. Stay out of this, Carter, or you're next. The crowd parted, phones raised, cameras flashing as whispers turned to accusations. Ruth felt the weight of their stares, judgment from people she'd taught, neighbors she'd known for decades. I've done nothing wrong, she said firmly, locking eyes with Baxter. Check your cameras. Leonard cleared his throat too quickly. The system glitched tonight. No footage. Ruth's stomach tightened. This was no accident. As Baxter grabbed her arm, cold metal cuffs snapping around her wrists, Samuel lunged again, only to be restrained by Ellis Kane. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice cracking. Ruth met his gaze, a silent plea for him to stop, then turned to the officers. You're digging your own graves, she murmured, her words a quiet thunder that sent a shiver through Baxter's frame as they marched her out into the night. The Laurel Creek jail was a squat gray building that smelled of damp concrete and despair. Ruth Jackson sat alone in a stark interrogation room, her wrists still raw from the cuffs they'd finally removed. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the metal table, where her hands rested, folded calmly despite the storm inside her. 3 hours had crawled by since her arrest at the gallery, and no one had come to question her, a deliberate silence meant to break her spirit. But Ruth had weathered worse than this. She'd raised a son through war and widowhood, taught children in a town that once spat at her for it. She wasn't about to crack now. Through the one-way glass, officers Roy Baxter and Ellis Kane watched her with growing unease. She hasn't said a damn word, Kane muttered, scratching his jaw. Just sits there like she's waiting for something. Baxter grunted, arms crossed. Old lady like her? Probably waiting for a lawyer to bail her out. Leonard's story holds. Judge Tate's on speed dial if we need to keep her locked up. Beyond them, Detective Amos Reed lingered in the hall, his weathered face tight with doubt. He'd known Ruth since she'd taught his daughter years ago. This didn't sit right. Ruth's stillness gnawed at him, a quiet defiance he couldn't shake. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I'm entitled to a phone call. Baxter smirked, but something in her tone made his grin falter. The female officer, a young woman named Tara Wells, escorted Ruth to a desk with a battered rotary phone, her eyes flicking with curiosity as she uncuffed one wrist. Ruth dialed a number she'd memorized decades ago, her fingers steady despite the ache in her joints. 4,000 miles away, in a dimly lit briefing room at a military base, Master Sergeant Danny Jackson hunched over maps with his team. The secure line rang, a rare sound that stopped him cold. Few had this number. Fewer dared use it. Jackson, he answered, his deep voice echoing in the sudden hush. Danny, Ruth's voice came through, steady, but laced with an undercurrent only he'd recognize. I need you. 3 heartbeats passed. Where? He asked, the word sharp as a gunshot. Laurel Creek Police Department. Charges, theft, obstruction. It's a setup. Another beat, then. I'm coming. Hold the line. In the briefing room, his team, Lena Ortiz, the wiry tech genius, and Ethan Brooks, the ex-JAG lawyer turned soldier, watched his face harden. That look meant war. He barked orders to his CO, then returned to the phone. Mom, I'll be there by morning. Don't say anything else to them. I won't, Ruth replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Love you, son. Love you too. As she hung up, Tara's gaze lingered, sensing something bigger than a small-town theft. Back in the room, Baxter scoffed. Who's she calling? Her bingo club. But Ruth's calm eyes promised a reckoning he couldn't yet fathom. The private airstrip outside Laurel Creek hummed with the whine of jet engines as dawn broke over the Alabama horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Master Sergeant Daniel "Danny" Jackson stepped off the sleek aircraft, his boots hitting the tarmac with purpose. At 45, his broad frame moved with a predator's grace, gray flecks in his close-cropped hair catching the light. He wore dark jeans and a black leather jacket, but his posture screamed soldier, shoulders squared, eyes scanning for threats. Behind him came Lena Ortiz, her fingers twitching like she ached for a keyboard, and Ethan Brooks, his sharp gaze already mapping the train. A black SUV waited, its driver leaning against the hood. Joe Turner, a grizzled vet with a limp, who'd served with Danny's father in '82. "Master Sergeant," Joe said, shaking Danny's hand with a grip that carried old loyalty. "Your mom's in deep this time." Danny nodded, his jaw tight. "What's the word?" As they climbed into the vehicle, Joe spilled the town's gossip. Ruth's arrest had split Laurel Creek. Half the folks who knew her swore she was innocent, while others whispered age had turned her desperate. "Edwin Caldwell's behind it," Joe added, eyes narrowing. "Been buying up Blackwater Row, piece by piece. Your mom's the last domino." Danny's gaze hardened, locking onto the road ahead. Then he's about to learn what happens when you push a Jackson too far. As the SUV rolled toward town, a knot of reporters swarmed the airport gate, cameras flashing like gunfire. "Mr. Jackson, are you here about Ruth Jackson's arrest?" a woman shouted, shoving a mic toward the window. Danny stared straight ahead, his silence a wall they couldn't breach. Lena smirked, already tapping her laptop. "Edwin Caldwell," she read aloud, "owns half the county's real estate, a string of shell companies, and a cozy relationship with Judge Gordon Tate. No convictions, but plenty of rumors. Intimidation, payoffs, you name it." Ethan leaned forward, his lawyer's mind clicking. "If he wants your mom's land, this arrest is his play. Smear her, force her out." Danny's voice was low, lethal. "He's using the whole damn system." Joe glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "There's more. Word is, a gallery girl, Clara Evans, saw something that night. She's scared stiff, works for Leonard Hayes. Might know where the truth's buried." Danny filed the name away, his mind already turning like a strategist on a battlefield. The SUV pulled up to the Laurel Creek Police Department, a squat brick fortress ringed with news vans. "Want me to stick around?" Joe asked. "No," Danny replied, stepping out, Lena and Ethan flanking him like shadows. "This might get messy." As they approached the entrance, a hush fell over the onlookers, their synchronized steps radiating a quiet menace that made even the reporters step back. Inside, Ruth's reckoning was waiting, and so was Danny's. The Laurel Creek Police Department loomed ahead, its brick walls stained by years of Alabama rain, the county seal glaring down like a dare. Danny Jackson strode through the double doors, Lena Ortiz and Ethan Brooks at his heels, their presence slicing through the precinct's stale air. The chatter of officers and ringing phones died as eyes turned to them, some curious, some wary. Danny's leather jacket creaked as he approached the front desk, where a rookie officer froze, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "I'm here to see Ruth Jackson," Danny said, his voice low and even, each word a stone dropped into still water. The rookie stammered, Visiting hours?" But Danny cut him off. "I'm her son. Now." Before the kid could fumble a reply, Roy Baxter swaggered out from a side hall, his scowl as permanent as the badge on his chest. "Can I help you?" he drawled, thumbs hooked in his belt, trying to match Danny's height with bravado. Danny turned, locking eyes with him, his gaze steady and unblinking, like a hawk sizing up prey. "You arrested my mother last night," he said, soft but sharp. "I'd like to see her." Baxter's smirk flickered, then faded as he took an unconscious step back. Chief Harold Grayson emerged from his office, wiping sweat from his brow. "Mr. Jackson," he said, forcing a smile, "let's talk in private." Danny didn't budge, his silence louder than any demand, until Grayson sighed and waved him toward the cells. The hallway to the holding cells echoed with the clank of boots on linoleum, the air thick with tension. Danny followed Grayson, Lena and Ethan trailing like sentinels, their eyes scanning every door and shadow. At the cell door, Ruth Jackson looked up, her green dress wrinkled but her posture regal. For a heartbeat, Danny's soldier mask slipped. His mother's tired eyes hit him harder than any battlefield wound. "Mom," he said, stepping inside as Grayson lingered awkwardly behind. Ruth rose, embracing him, her grip fierce despite her age. "I knew you'd come," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in the cold room. "Always," he replied, pulling back to study her. "They're saying I stole that necklace," Ruth began, sitting again, her hands clasped. "Leonard Hayes set it up. I saw him hovering near that case all night. It's about the house, Danny. Caldwell's behind it." Danny nodded, his jaw tightening. "Joe told me. We'll fix this." He turned to Grayson, who shifted under his stare. "Remove her cuffs." Ellis Kane, hovering nearby, hesitated, but Danny's quiet command, "Now," made him comply, fumbling with the keys. As the metal clicked free, Ruth rubbed her wrists, a faint smile breaking through. Outside, Ethan murmured to Lena, who'd already slipped to a terminal, her fingers flying over keys. "Found a deleted file," she hissed. "Hayes near the case. Time-stamped." Danny's eyes darkened with resolve. This wasn't just a fight for Ruth anymore. It was war against a town's rotten core. The old diner on Main Street smelled of burnt coffee and grease, its faded sign creaking in the midday breeze. Danny Jackson pushed through the door, Ethan Brooks at his side, their boots thudding against the chipped linoleum. Clara Evans sat in a corner booth, her hands wrapped tight around a chip mug, her eyes darting like a trapped deer's. She was young, barely 20, with a scholarship to an art school upstate, but the weight of the past 2 days had carved shadows under her eyes. "Miss Johnson's boy?" she whispered as Danny slid into the seat across from her. He nodded, his gaze steady, but not unkind. "Joe Turner said you saw something at the gallery." Clara swallowed hard, glancing at the window where the street baked under the Alabama sun. "I didn't want to get involved," she started, voice trembling. "Mr. Hayes, Leonard, he took the tears of Magnolia himself. I saw him slip it out during Samuel's speech when everyone was distracted. He locked it in his office safe, then told me to say I saw Miss Ruth near the case." Her fingers tightened on the mug. "He said if I didn't, I'd lose my job, my scholarship, everything." Danny leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "You're safe now, Clara. Tell us everything." She hesitated, then nodded, tears brimming. "He got a call that night, Edwin Caldwell's voice on the line. They planned it all." Ethan's pen scratched furiously, capturing every word. Before Clara could say more, the diner's door slammed open, and 3 men in dark jackets stormed in, their eyes locking onto her. Danny's instincts kicked in. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her down as a tray crashed to the floor. "Get behind me," he ordered, his voice a steel thread. Ethan flipped the table for cover, his hand slipping to the concealed holster at his back. The lead thug, a broad man with a scar slicing his brow, sneered. "Hand her over, soldier boy. Caldwell don't like loose ends." Danny didn't flinch, rising slow and deliberate, his frame a wall between Clara and the threat. "You're not touching her?" What followed was a blur of motion. Danny lunged, disarming the scarred man with a twist that snapped his wrist, then drove an elbow into the second thug's throat. Ethan tackled the third, pinning him as the diner's few patrons screamed and scattered. Clara huddled against the wall sobbing, but Danny's calm voice cut through the chaos. "Stay down, we've got this." Sirens wailed in the distance as the thugs crumpled, groaning. Ethan secured them with zip ties from his pack, muttering, "Amateurs." Clara looked up, trembling. "I'm so sorry, Miss Ruth didn't deserve this." Danny crouched beside her, his tone softening. "You're doing right by her now. That's what counts." Outside, tires screeched. Backup was close, but so was the fight ahead. Caldwell's reach was long, and this was just the beginning. The Laurel Creek courthouse stood like a weathered sentinel beside the Blackwater River, its stone steps slick with late afternoon drizzle. Inside, the air thrummed with urgency as Danny Jackson escorted his mother, Ruth, through a crowd of reporters and onlookers, Ethan Brooks clearing a path with sharp elbows and sharper words. Clara Evans trailed close, her face pale but her jaw set, clutching Ethan's arm like a lifeline. This was no ordinary bail hearing. Ethan had pulled strings with old JAG contacts to force an emergency session, armed with Clara's testimony and Lena's hacked footage. Ruth, in her green dress and pearls, walked with quiet dignity. but her eyes burned with resolve. Judge Gordon Tate took the bench, his silver hair slicked back, his expression sour as he glared at Ruth. "Let's make this quick," he snapped, adjusting his robes. Ethan rose, voice crisp. "Your Honor, we have evidence of corruption tying this arrest to Edwin Caldwell and Leonard Hayes. Mrs. Jackson's detention is baseless." He slid documents across the table. Bank records showing payments from Caldwell to Hayes, time-stamped right after Ruth's arrest. Tate's fingers twitched, his gaze darting to the gallery where Leonard Hayes sat, sweating through his suit. "This is preposterous," Tate barked. "No proof connects." Mid-sentence, he froze, his face draining of color. Danny followed his stare to the courtroom doors, where a figure slipped out, a man in a hurry. "He's running," Danny muttered, nudging Ethan. Tate's exit was their first crack in Caldwell's wall. Chaos erupted as Judge Tate bolted from the bench, his robes flapping like a panicked bird's wings. Danny lunged toward the door, but Ethan grabbed his arm. "Let him go. We've got bigger fish." The courtroom buzzed, reporters scribbling furiously as a new judge, Evelyn Harper, strode in. Tall, stern, her dark eyes cutting through the confusion. "Order," she commanded, her gavel slamming once. "I'm taking over. Proceed, Mr. Brooks." Ethan didn't miss a beat, presenting Clara's affidavit and Lena's recovered video. Leonard Hayes, clear as day, pocketing the tears of Magnolia. Harper's brow furrowed as she watched, then turned to the prosecution. "Explain this." The assistant DA, a jittery young man named Paul Sims, stammered, We weren't aware." Harper cut him off. "You're aware now. Mrs. Jackson's arrest reeks of fabrication. Bail's set at $500, payable immediately." Ruth exhaled, a faint smile touching her lips as Danny squeezed her shoulder. But the victory was short-lived. Leonard Hayes rose, his voice shrill. "She was there. I saw her." His lie hung thin and brittle, his hands shaking as Harper's stare pinned him. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," she warned. "You'll have your turn." Outside, news vans multiplied, cameras rolling as Ruth emerged, free but not cleared. Danny scanned the crowd, his mind already on the next move. Caldwell's puppet had cracked, but the puppeteer was still pulling strings. Ruth's fight was far from over, and Blackwater Row's survival hung in the balance. Ruth Jackson's wooden house in Blackwater Row glowed with lantern light, its sagging porch alive with the hum of neighbors' voices. Night had fallen over Laurel Creek, the air thick with the scent of magnolias and fried chicken, brought by folks who'd known Ruth for decades. She stood at the door, her green dress swapped for a worn apron, welcoming each arrival with a tired but genuine smile. Samuel Carter hauled a folding table, his broad hands steady as he set it with pies and sweet tea. Clara Evans hovered nearby, her guilt softening into resolve as she helped arrange chairs. This wasn't just a gathering, it was a stand, a community rallying around the woman who'd taught their kids and held their history. Danny Jackson watched from the porch steps, his leather jacket draped over a rail, his eyes tracking every shadow beyond the yard. Ethan Brooks paced inside, phone pressed to his ear, pulling legal favors to keep Ruth free. Lena Ortiz sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop glowing as she dug through Caldwell's digital dirt. "He's been strong-arming folks out of Blackwater Row for years," she said, voice sharp. "Fake citations, jacked up taxes. Ruth's not the first." Ruth joined them, her hands clasping a photo of her late husband, Isaiah, building this house plank by plank. "He poured his soul into this place," she said softly, her voice thick with memory. "Caldwell wants to erase that." Danny's fist clenched. This was personal now, deeper than any mission he'd fought overseas. The chatter in Ruth's yard died abruptly as a low boom echoed from the riverbank, a plume of smoke curling into the night sky. Danny shot to his feet, his soldier's instincts flaring. Someone had set off an explosive, close enough to rattle the windows. "Stay here," he barked, grabbing his jacket as Ethan and Lena followed him into the dark. Neighbors clutched each other, fear rippling through the crowd, but Ruth stepped forward, her voice steady. "They're trying to scare us," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "We don't run." Her words anchored them, a quiet fire against the chaos. Danny sprinted toward the source, a smoldering trash can near the water's edge. Its contents charred, but the message clear. Caldwell wasn't done. Ethan scanned the shadows, muttering, "Desperate move? Means he's rattled." Lena's fingers flew over her phone, pulling feeds from nearby cameras. Got a truck peeling out. Black, no plates. His goons. Danny's eyes narrowed, his breath steady despite the adrenaline. He's escalating. We end this soon, or it gets uglier. Back at the house, Ruth stood with Samuel and Clara, her gaze fixed on the river. They'll come harder now, she said, more to herself than them, but so will we. As Danny returned, his silhouette against the flickering lanterns, he met her eyes and nodded once. Caldwell had lit a fuse tonight, one that would burn straight to the gallery, where the truth was locked away, waiting to be unleashed. The Laurel Arts Gallery stood silent under a moonless sky, its glass windows dark as the Blackwater River murmured nearby. Danny Jackson crouched in the shadows, Lena Ortiz beside him, her laptop casting a faint glow as she disabled the security system. Cameras down, alarms off, 30-minute window, she whispered, her fingers a blur. Ethan Brooks kept watch at the alley's mouth, his sharp eyes tracking the empty street. After the explosion at Ruth's, Danny knew they couldn't wait. Caldwell's desperation was a ticking clock, and the tears of Magnolia was the key to breaking his grip. "Safe's in Hayes' office," he said, voice low. "Let's move." They slipped inside through a side door Lena had jimmied, the air thick with the scent of paint and polish. The gallery felt like a tomb, its art pieces looming like ghosts. Danny led the way, his steps silent from years of covert ops, until they reached Hayes' office, a cluttered space with a heavy oak desk and a steel safe bolted to the wall. Lena cracked the lock in under a minute, her tools clicking softly. The door swung open, revealing the necklace, diamonds glinting like frozen tears, nestled beside a stack of papers. Danny grabbed them, scanning quickly. Bank transfers, emails, all tying Caldwell to the setup. "Jackpot," Ethan muttered, pocketing the evidence. But as Danny turned to leave, a shadow moved in the hall, boots scuffing, a gun's safety clicking off. They weren't alone. Danny dropped low, signaling Lena and Ethan to take cover as three figures burst into the office. Hired muscle, their faces hard and eyes cold. The leader, a hulking man with a shaved head, leveled a pistol at Danny's chest. "Drop the goods, soldier," he growled. "Caldwell wants this clean." Danny didn't blink, his hands steady as he slid the necklace and papers behind his back to Lena. "You're late," he said, voice calm as death. Before the thug could respond, Danny surged forward, slamming the man's wrist against the desk. Crack. The gun clattered free. Chaos erupted. Ethan tackled a second goon, driving him into a filing cabinet with a grunt, while Lena swung her laptop like a club, catching the third across the jaw. Danny wrestled the leader, his training a brutal dance, knee to gut, elbow to temple, until the man slumped, groaning. The fight was over in seconds, the air heavy with sweat and silence. "Zip tie them," Danny ordered, breathing steady as Ethan secured the men. Lena stuffed the evidence into her bag, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline ebbed. "We've got what we need," she said, voice tight. Danny nodded, glancing at the safe. Empty now, but its secrets were theirs. As they slipped out into the night, sirens wailed faintly, too far to catch them. Back at Blackwater Row, Ruth waited, her prayers a quiet thread tying her to her son's mission, and the truth about to break free. The Laurel Creek courthouse buzzed with restless energy, its packed gallery a sea of faces, neighbors, reporters, and activists, craning to see justice unfold. Ruth Jackson sat at the defense table, her green dress pressed crisp, pearls gleaming under the lights. Her calm a stark contrast to the storm brewing. Danny stood behind her, a silent pillar, while Ethan Brooks arranged their evidence. The tears of Magnolia, bank records, and a USB drive with Caldwell's damning voice. Judge Evelyn Harper presided, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as she called order. "Let's hear the truth today," she said, voice like iron. Ethan rose, presenting Clara Evans first. She took the stand, hands trembling but eyes steady. "I saw Leonard Hayes take the necklace," she said, voice clear despite the weight. "He hid it in his safe, then told me to lie. Said Miss Ruth did it." Caldwell called him that night. I heard him order it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan followed with the video Lena had salvaged, Hayes' blurry figure pocketing the gem during Samuel's speech. Then the recording played. Caldwell's cold drawl, "Break the old woman, ruin her, I want that land." The room went still, the words a noose tightening around Edwin Caldwell, who sat in the gallery, his face a mask of fury. Ruth met his glare, her eyes not accusing but pitying, a look that cut deeper than rage. The prosecution's young DA, Paul Sims, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the case slipping through his fingers. Edwin Caldwell's mask cracked as Ethan laid out the bank transfers, tens of thousands wired to Hayes and Judge Tate the night of Ruth's arrest. "This isn't theft," Ethan declared, voice ringing. "It's a conspiracy to destroy a woman and her community for profit." Judge Harper's expression hardened, her gavel poised. "Mr. Sims, your response?" Paul Sims stood, sweat beading on his brow. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mrs. Jackson." A cheer erupted, but Harper silenced it with a bang. "Granted, Mrs. Jackson, you're free, with this court's apology." Ruth nodded, a quiet triumph in her eyes as Danny squeezed her shoulder. But Caldwell couldn't hold back. He shot to his feet, face red, voice booming. "This is a farce. I built this town. You can't touch me." The outburst stunned the room. Harper's stare turned glacial. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell, or I'll hold you in contempt." He ignored her, jabbing a finger at Ruth. "She's nothing, a stubborn old fool standing in the way of progress." Danny tensed, but Ruth's hand on his arm stopped him. Ethan seized the moment, sliding a final document to Harper. "His own words, Your Honor, caught planning this on tape." Caldwell's lawyer, a slick man in a pinstripe suit, leapt up. "Objection!" Too late, Harper's gavel fell. "Mr. Caldwell, you're detained pending investigation." As bailiffs moved in, Ruth whispered to Danny, "He's finished." But the fire in Caldwell's eyes said this war wasn't over yet. Morning light spilled over Laurel Creek, gilding the courthouse steps where reporters swarmed like bees after Edwin Caldwell's outburst. Inside a county jail cell, Judge Gordon Tate sat, disheveled and broken, his once impeccable suit replaced by a jumpsuit. Danny Jackson, Ethan Brooks, and Ruth stood across from him in a stark conference room, the air heavy with the weight of his surrender. "I didn't want this," Tate rasped, avoiding Ruth's gaze. "Caldwell pushed me, zoning favors at first, then the land grabs. Blackwater Row was his obsession." Ethan slid a recorder across the table, his voice crisp. "Tell us everything. Dates, names, payments." Tate nodded, spilling years of corruption in a trembling monotone. Outside, the town reeled as news broke. Caldwell had made bail, slipping through a friendly judge's hands before dawn. Danny's team tracked him to Caldwell Enterprises' gleaming office tower, where Lena Ortiz intercepted frantic calls, orders to shred files, move assets. "He's scrambling," she reported, her laptop humming. Ruth listened, her face etched with quiet fury. "He's hurt more than just me," she said, her mind on the families forced from their homes. Samuel Carter arrived, unveiling a new painting, Ruth triumphant, Blackwater Row rising behind her. "This is for us," he said, voice thick. But as they planned their next move, FBI agents stormed in, led by Special Agent Maria Klein, a no-nonsense woman with a warrant in hand. "We've got him now," she said, eyeing Tate's confession. Caldwell's empire was teetering, and the fall was coming fast. The FBI raid hit Caldwell Enterprises like a thunderclap, agents swarming the glass and steel tower as employees scattered. Lena hacked into the security feed, watching Caldwell bark orders in his penthouse office, shredders whining as papers turned to confetti. "He's torching it all," she muttered, feeding intel to Agent Klein. Downstairs, Danny and Ethan joined the breach, moving with military precision through marble halls. They found him cornered, Edwin Caldwell, sweat-slick and wild-eyed, clutching a phone. "You're done," Danny said, voice cold as steel. Caldwell sneered, "You think this stops me? I own this state." But his bravado cracked as Klein slapped cuffs on him, reading his rights over his protests. Back at the jail, Danny faced Caldwell one last time through the bars. "You'll pay for every home you took," Danny said, his calm masking a fury that made Caldwell flinch. "Keep dreaming, soldier," Caldwell spat, but his eyes flickered with fear. His empire was ash, his allies turning on him. Ruth, meanwhile, rallied the displaced families of Blackwater Row, her voice a beacon as they filed a class action suit with Ethan's help. "We take back what's ours," she declared, her strength igniting theirs. News vans captured Samuel's painting on every screen, a symbol of resistance. As Caldwell's assets froze and Tate's testimony widened the probe, Laurel Creek exhaled, a town reborn. But Ruth knew the final note of this song was hers to sing, and it waited by the river's edge. A week after Edwin Caldwell's fall, Blackwater Row bloomed with life under a golden Alabama sun. Ruth Jackson's yard spilled over with neighbors, old and young, their laughter mingling with the hum of the river nearby. Tables groaned under plates of cornbread, collards, and peach cobbler, a feast to celebrate the court's ruling. Caldwell's assets would fund the return of homes to their rightful owners. Ruth stood at the center, her apron dusted with flour, her pearls catching the light as she hugged each family reclaiming their legacy. Danny Jackson watched from the porch, his leather jacket off, a rare softness in his eyes. "You did this, Mom," he said, voice low. She smiled, touching his cheek. "We did." Clara Evans darted through the crowd organizing kids' games, her guilt replaced by purpose. Samuel Carter unveiled his latest painting, a vibrant mural of Blackwater Row's rebirth, its colors a promise etched in time. Ethan Brooks and Lena Ortiz mingled, their work done, though Ethan was already drafting laws to shield historic neighborhoods. As dusk crept in, a mail carrier handed Ruth a letter, its handwriting shaky but familiar. She stepped away, opening it alone by the riverbank. "Ruth," it read, "I was wrong. Greed blinded me to what I destroyed. Forgive me if you can." Signed Edwin Caldwell, from a cell where he'd sit for decades. Her breath caught, the words a weight she hadn't expected. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but this wasn't just her victory, it was theirs. Ruth folded the letter, her hands trembling as the Blackwater River murmured beside her, its dark surface reflecting the first stars. She looked back at the glowing lanterns, the faces of her neighbors, people who'd stood with her when the world turned cold. Caldwell's words echoed, a plea from a man stripped bare, but they couldn't erase the pain he'd sown. Yet as she stood there, a melody rose unbidden, a hymn her father had sung, Wade in the Water, its notes carrying loss and redemption. She began to hum, then sing, her voice soft but clear, threading through the night. One by one, voices joined, Samuel's deep baritone, Clara's shaky soprano, the children's bright chorus, until Blackwater Row rang with a song of survival. Danny stepped to her side, his eyes glistening as he added his low harmony, a soldier's strength bending to his mother's grace. The hymn swelled, a tide washing over the scars of greed, binding them in something stronger than vengeance. Hope. Ruth raised her face to the sky, the letter slipping from her fingers into the river, carried away like a burden released. She'd fought not just for her home, but for this moment, a community unbroken, a legacy reborn. As the last note faded, Clara approached, a folder in hand. "Miss Ruth, let's tell our stories. Keep them alive." Ruth nodded, smiling. "Yes, child, we will." By the river's edge, Laurel Creek stood whole, its song a testament to what courage could build and what it could forgive.